Hi, friends. Zach Mickle here, host of Whitfordstock's Theology Mill podcast. Thanks for taking the time to tune in to our little show today. On this special episode, we are sharing with you all a conversation in which I was actually on the other side of the microphone, being interviewed by a fellow named Dr. Martin Robb on his wonderful podcast, which you should check out. It's a podcast on care ethics, and it's called Careful Thinking. So in the conversation, Martin and I chatted about a number of different things, but the conversation centered primarily around my new book, The Unthinkable Sacrifice, which came out with Cascade in 2025. And in that book, I try to present sort of a philosophy of fatherhood. But Martin and I also just chatted more generally about my experience of fatherhood, and also how French philosophy of religion in particular has given me a number of kind of helpful concepts for thinking about my own practice of parenthood. So I hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks as always for listening.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Careful Thinking, a podcast series exploring ideas about care. I'm Martin Robb, and I'm the host of the podcast. In each episode of Careful Thinking, you'll hear an in-depth conversation with a writer, researcher, or practitioner at the cutting edge of current thinking about care. For this episode, I'm really pleased to be joined by Zechariah Mickle. Zach is an independent scholar working at the intersection of continental philosophy and theology. He holds an MA in philosophy from the Global Center for Advanced Studies, and he's worked in schools as a therapeutic skills trainer, and also as a marketing manager and associate editor at Whitfordstock Publishers, where he continues to host the Theology Mill podcast. Based in Oregon in the United States, Zach is a husband and a father to 2 young children, and he's also employed as an apprentice plumber. Zach has published articles in Commonweal magazine and in the Global Center for Advanced Studies Review. He's the author of the book The Unthinkable Sacrifice, an essay on fatherhood, published by Cascade in 2025, which provides an account of the experience of early fatherhood using the tools of phenomenological philosophy. He's also the co-editor of the forthcoming book, The Eucharist and Continental Philosophy, to be published by Fordham University Press. So it was sometime last September when I came across a review in the online journal Fairer Disputations of a new book which apparently explored its author's personal experience as a father of a young child, while at the same time drawing on contemporary continental philosophy, and specifically on some of the thinkers associated with the so-called theological turn in French phenomenology. And as a researcher on fatherhood myself, as well as someone interested in the work of that particular group of philosophers, I was intrigued. I reviewed The Unbearable Sacrifice briefly at my Substack newsletter, but I really wanted to hear more about the background to the book and the thinking behind it. So I was delighted when its author, Zach, accepted my invitation to be a guest on Careful Thinking. So Zach, a very warm welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, Martin.
Now, I'd like to begin by asking you to say something about yourself and your background, something I always do at the beginning of an episode. What was your life like growing up, and what were the early influences that shaped you?
Sure. Well, yeah, it's a pleasure to be on the show. This is my first time on this side of the microphone, I guess you could say. I've hosted a lot of podcast episodes, but I now have a new respect for being on the other side of the microphone. So yeah, it's a pleasure though. I've enjoyed the show. As I said, I discovered it when I found your review of my book, and have listened to several episodes. And this is my first kind of foray into care ethics, which has been really kind of fascinating to learn a bit about. So as far as my background, so as you said, I come from Oregon. I've lived in Oregon my whole life, so that's in the United States. And for those who aren't familiar with kind of the geography of North America, it's in what we call kind of the Pacific Northwest corner of the U.S. So I grew up in a small town, kind of right in the middle of the state. So we call it Central Oregon, kind of nestled beside some really beautiful mountains and rivers. So that in itself, I think, has left kind of a really deep impression on me. And I think is a big reason why I tend to have kind of more of a contemplative bent, even still, and I've always had kind of a great love of the natural world. And growing up, so my father was a graphic designer, and then my mother was a school nurse in a kind of a special education classroom setting. And both my parents came from kind of working class homes, and so our homes had this really kind of working class feel about it. So they both have been huge influences on me in kind of a number of ways, but especially in matters of faith. And then after high school, so I moved up north about 3 hours to go to college here in the Portland area. Portland, for those who aren't familiar, is kind of the biggest city in the state of Oregon and one of the bigger ones on the west coast of the US. And so I've been in the metro area ever since then, so about 15 years now. And my wife and I married in 2014. We were just babies at that time. I was 21 and she was 23. I was only in my third year of college at that point. And then since then, we've been blessed with two daughters who are now 5 and 2, and we're about to welcome our third pretty much any day now. So very, very, very soon. So yeah, so I would say also my wife and my daughters have also been a big influence on me for sure.
Thank you. I can confirm from visiting that Oregon is certainly a beautiful part of the US. It's
It
wonderful
really is.
when you fly into Portland over the forests and the mountains. It's truly spectacular. And yeah, I wish you all the best with forthcoming birth. I hope that all goes
Thank you.
well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, you mentioned the influence of your parents on your faith, and I know that you come from an evangelical Christian background, but you're now Catholic. So I wonder if you could say something about that journey and about the importance of faith in your life and your work.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, as you said, I grew up in a kind of a devout evangelical home. And we had really, and still do have really kind of deep roots in the Foursquare denomination, if folks are familiar with that at all. It's kind of an evangelical Protestant sort of Pentecostal tradition that rose up out of kind of Southern California in the early 20th century and has a really prominent presence on the West Coast, but has increasingly in the decades since become much more of a global force. So it's very much in my bloodline. Like my father's father, so my grandpa was a Foursquare pastor and a missionary to several different nations in Africa, and then my father's brother, so my uncle, also a Foursquare missionary and pastor, and then my dad. So I said earlier that he was a graphic designer, but when I was in college, he also transitioned into full time ministry with Foursquare. So now that's his job and his vocation is a Foursquare pastor. But then I decided in my mid 20s to go and do something totally radically different. And I entered the Catholic Church, as you said. So initially, that all kind of started when I was going to this non denominational church after college. And this Jesuit priest came and spoke on contemplative prayer at the church. And I was just really drawn in and found something really kind of profound in his spiritual presence that was really attractive to me. So I actually started meeting with that Jesuit priest for spiritual direction. I kind of started reading Thomas Merton and some other kind of Catholic spiritual writers. I started making retreats at some of the local monasteries here in the area. And then finally, kind of the last straw, I would say the final straw was that I started going to Mass. And so everything just kind of really unfolded from there as I really fell in love with the Catholic spiritual tradition in particular, but then also with the liturgy, right, with the Eucharist over time. So my faith, it's always been really important to me, and still is really a central feature of my life. So it really shapes kind of how I think about everything in my world, how I approach everything, whether that's my marriage, my parenting, my work, the neighborhood we live in, really anything that sort of touches my life. I kind of see through the lens of my faith, I would say.
Oh, thank you for sharing that, Zach. And that story kind of resonates with me in lots of ways. Had a very similar journey, and Thomas Merton was a huge influence on me when I was thinking about becoming Catholic as well. So I found that really interesting. And you said earlier that you're the father of two daughters with a third child on the way. And obviously that personal experience of fatherhood is central to the book we're going to discuss. I wonder if you could talk about your experience of becoming a father and the impact it had on you, and about the extent to which you're involved in the care of your daughters.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to answer that. So, I mean, the first thing I would want to say is that I really have loved being a father. Like it's been really fun, enjoyable journey for me. I would say it's a vocation that I really thoroughly enjoy and that feels really meaningful to me, even though it is a difficult vocation at the same time. So even I think even like as a child, I sort of always expected that I would be a father one day. Family was always really important to me. I always thought that I would enjoy and love being a father, and that's kind of exactly how things have turned out. Even still, though, with all that sort of anticipation and expectation I had of being a father, I don't think I could have anticipated the sort of depth of love that I would experience, or the depths of kind of responsibilities that are required in caring for children, right? So caring for our 2 daughters and about to be 3 daughters. So my wife and I, we're both very involved in caring for our girls. So we both, change diapers, we both give baths, cook meals, pack lunches, do the laundry, go to the extracurricular events, right? Wrestle and color and play with Legos, all the things. And up until last April, as you mentioned, I worked for Whip and Stock Publishers, and that was all remote work. So I worked entirely from home. So I also, during the first few years of my two daughters' lives, I've had a lot of FaceTime with them, sort of working from home and being around them quite a bit.
So in my introduction, I also said that as well as being an author of books and articles about philosophy, you're also an apprentice plumber, which is quite an unusual combination for a philosophical writer. So I wonder if you could say how that came about and how your work as a plumber fits into the pattern of your life.
Sure. Yeah. I'm not sure it's will be a terribly interesting story. Who knows? Maybe it will to folks, but I'm definitely happy to talk about it. Before I went into book publishing and pursued sort of a kind of an alt academic career, I had actually worked in my mid 20s as a plumbing apprentice. So I did that for a couple of years, and then decided to sort of pursue this dream and go to grad school for philosophy. I got a job in publishing, and from there, kind of my own writing and intellectual networking really took off in ways that I wasn't expecting and that were really exciting for me. And I I would say I fully expected to make a career in publishing, to be honest. I thought like, "Oh, I've found it," right? In my mid-20s, I felt like, "Okay, I've found the thing that I could easily devote my life's work to." But as our family grew, that path became kind of increasingly untenable financially for us as a family. So my wife and I had to think really long and hard. I mean, this was like a 2-year process of trying to discern what to do, but kind of how to proceed. So we prayed a lot. And then eventually I decided to return to the plumbing apprenticeship that I had been in previously, and then sort of continuing my philosophical and theological interests on the side. So having that be sort of an avocation, I guess you could say, rather than a sort of my day job. So as I said, last April, so it's been almost a year, I started working again at the same plumbing shop that I had worked at before. And thankfully, the apprenticeship program kind of let me back in where I had left off. So I'm on year two, a little over halfway through year two of 4 years in the apprenticeship. It's a 4-year program. And then once I finish that, I'll be able to test for my journeyman license and work on my own. So that's kind of the highest licensure here in the state of Oregon where I live. So yeah, so now I spend my weekdays doing residential remodel plumbing, which can be quite arduous work. Right, even this morning it's a Saturday, but my hands are very sore from the wrenches I was using yesterday. It's also though like and I noticed this the first time around when I was in plumbing. It's surprisingly very technical um, and like intellectually involved sort of work. You really have to be, I mean, not with all the tasks, but with a lot of the tasks, you really have to be sort of mentally engaged and present. How the plumbing career fits into sort of the overall pattern of my life, I think that's a hard question for me to answer because I think it's almost too early to say. I would say I'm still very much kind of feeling out and just beginning to get a sense of what that might look like and how it might sort of be integrated a little more holistically into the rest of my life. Yeah, my wife and I, we really made that decision out of kind of a place of financial necessity, I would say. But now that I'm, as I said, almost a year into it, I think I'm beginning to kind of finally acclimate to what has been a significant and not always easy transition, and even kind of I've noticed myself starting to dream a bit about how I can kind of integrate this path, this new career path, with some of my sort of interests in philosophy and theology, and with our family life as well.
That's really interesting. It's always useful to have a backup source of income. I think if you're in writing or academic life,
Oh my
and also,
gosh, yeah,
and also something to do that doesn't require, deep abstract thought 24 hours a day. I think it's really nice to have something that's
yes.
really a relief from that. Now, you've mentioned moving into writing and publishing. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the different roles you've had with the publisher Whip and Stock, and also how your role as a host of the Theology Mill podcast came about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I worked full time at Whiffenstock for about 5.5 years, and really, really enjoyed. Like I adored my time working there. I loved being there, and I do still work on a very part time basis, as you said, kind of keeping the podcast going. But when I say very part time, I mean like 3 to 5 hours a week. So it's really, I mean, it's gone from a full time job to something that's very much sort of a side part of my life. Initially, I was an editorial assistant there, so I got kind of hired on entry level. I did a lot of admin work and copy editing. And then about a year and a half in, I got moved into a digital marketing role. And then that role kind of just gradually expanded over time. And so it also came to include some acquisitions editing, which was a lot of fun. Getting to kind of work with prospective authors who were interested in publishing with Whiffenstock, and then as well as launching the podcast, which we launched, I think it was in 2022. But yeah, I'd say I've often felt like I had to sort of pinch myself that I got paid to do that sort of work. It almost never really felt like work. Not that it wasn't, couldn't be difficult, but more so that I just, it felt more like play almost, like I was getting to entertain a hobby and get paid for it, which was at times pretty surreal. And then how the podcast came about, um, basically, I saw an avenue that our marketing could go in, and kind of pitched that to my boss, and then he was really generous all throughout and giving me a lot of room to sort of roam free with that, and kind of trusting me with that project. And then it's been a lot of fun getting to interview some of my intellectual heroes, so people like Emmanuel Falk, Stanley Hauerwas, Bill Kavanaugh. But just as fun, I think, has been getting to have lots of conversations with younger scholars who are doing, I mean, people who are more, closer to sort of my age, who are doing really interesting work as well in philosophy and theology.
Yeah, I was going to say, for those who don't know the publisher, it's true to say that it majors in philosophy and theology. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say it majors in theology and biblical studies and minors in philosophy, but with an increasing kind of philosophy list growing, I would say.
Well, you mentioned a couple of the people that you've interviewed. I've enjoyed listening to those episodes, and I realize it's invidious to ask a podcast host who their favorite guest has been, but I wonder if any interviews or episodes have stood out for you as highlights.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can honestly say I've enjoyed every single episode I've done, and everybody has been a pleasure to work with. I think some of the highlights that stand out kind of in my memory are some of the ones I mentioned. Emmanuel Falk, who has been a real like intellectual hero of mine. Stanley Hauerwas. I got to interview John Baer, John Swinton. I don't know if these names will be familiar to your audience, perhaps some of them. William Kavanaugh, and then some of the younger folks I was talking about. Steve Nepper, Martin Kochi, Stephen DeLay, Sarah Livick Moses. So I did a lot of like series. So what we called like booths. So we did like a Bulgakov booth on the work of the Eastern Orthodox priest and
Mm.
theologian Sergius Bulgakov. We did a phenomenology booth. That was the one where I got to interview Emmanuel Falk and some others on kind of the development of phenomenology and kind of tracing its history. So I would say a lot of those booth series were a lot of fun to do.
Well, I would advise people who want to look up those names to look up the Theology Mill podcast, where those episodes are still live, and it's an education in philosophy and theology, I can tell you. Now, you mentioned as one of your star guests, Stephen DeLay, who was a name that was very familiar to me. I mentioned earlier that you took a master's course in philosophy. And I also know that the foreword to your book is written by Stephen DeLay, who's the author of the book Phenomenology in France, which is perhaps the best introduction to the so-called theological turn in modern French philosophy. Certainly a book that I've found personally really helpful and interesting. And he describes you as his former student. So I wonder if you could say something about your relationship and connection with Stephen, and about how you were introduced to the thinkers that you write about in the book.
Sure, yeah. So Stephen, what? Yeah, he was my professor. I didn't go into my master's at GCAS knowing that he was affiliated there. And then when I discovered that, having read his Phenomenology in France book, the one you just mentioned, I was really excited and trying to figure out how I could. How I already knew him because he published a lot with Whip and Stock Publishers, but trying to figure out how I could maybe yeah, not use him as a resource, but get to know him, as a teacher as well. And so I was very fortunate to get to do a directed readings class with him. So we worked through, I think it was 8 books on the theological turn in France, in French phenomenology. So that was a lot of fun. We got to meet. We met, I think, 4 times, and read all those books and got to work through them really in detail. So he was the one who really introduced me, beyond books and materials that I had read on French phenomenology. He was the one who really introduced me to the theological turn, and we've been friends ever since. And obviously, as you said, got to he agreed to write the foreword for my book, and he was one of the readers on my master's thesis as well. So
Yeah, I find him a really accessible writer for those of us who are not trained as
yeah.
philosophers. That book in particular, but I mean everything he's written is really recommended for anybody who wants to get to grips with phenomenology, I think. So let's move on now, Zach, to your book, The Unthinkable Sacrifice, an essay on fatherhood. I'm interested to know how the idea for the book came about and how did it develop as you were writing it?
Yeah, so the book, it started as an idea for my master's thesis, and so I was sort of thinking through what I could write about for that thesis, and thinking about that while I was in the midst of being a young dad. So being in the midst of kind of one of the most, if not the most, kind of powerful experiences of my life, and so I really felt tugged toward kind of thinking through that experience in a really thorough way and kind of using the tools of philosophy. So basically, my readings that I was already doing in phenomenology at that time were kind of always illuminating aspects of that experience of being a young father. And so I was really feeling this need to try to kind of cobble together my experience as a father and all these readings that I felt were sort of shedding light on my experience as a father, and then trying to kind of make meaning of all that, all that reading and all that fathering, and how those two might sort of speak to each other. Initially, as probably a lot of book ideas do, I think I had in mind to write something that was a bit more extensive and kind of more ambitious, and then and I really wanted to think through kind of a parent's love of their child as something sort of Eucharistic and eschatological, to use a couple big words, right? But those are kind of two themes that I hope to return to in later work, and certainly there's a streak of the Eucharistic and eschatological in the book, but as I was kind of researching and writing, it quickly became apparent to me that this was too much for a master's thesis for the word count that I was given, and that it was going to be plenty enough material to sift through just to kind of think through a simpler thing, which was like how a father might carry his child's soul, right? His child's sort of unique person and all its sort of plenitude and excess. Before what I didn't necessarily get to as fully in the book was this sort of arriving at the place of needing to surrender the child's soul, or sort of offer it, right? So offering it sort of to God in like a Eucharistic manner, as I said, right, and trusting that this precious soul of your child to sort of its eschatological fulfillment in Christ, essentially. So the book really kind of narrowed and focused the more that I worked on it, and became primarily about how how one sort of carries that plenitude, right? Their child's plenitude, how a father experiences that excess in his child, how he grapples with the risks and the sufferings that the child is exposed to, simply by being a human being in the world, right? And what it might mean to carry that plenitude in a way that is prayerful, and that is accepting of the fears that can visit a father, right, as he sort of conducts this work of love for his child. So I was really sort of grappling with certain fears in being a father, right, in these early years. So in some ways, the book was a pretty personal endeavor. It was a way for me to sort of process my own fears as a young father, as I said, and to try to make sense of them as well, and also to begin discerning what it might mean to hold those fears a little more prayerfully, maybe a little less neurotically, to offer them in more of a posture of surrender, or as sort of an offering of love, I guess, is a way you could talk about it.
Thank you for that.
That's
So
right.
In the introduction to the book, Zach, you write, "What I'm to undertake here is not so much a Christian philosophy of fatherhood, but rather a phenomenological description of fatherhood that is open to the kind of sacredness of the imago Dei within the human person that Christianity teaches." So I wonder, to what extent is the book a theological as much as a philosophical text? And how would you answer the criticism that you really need to be a religious believer to fully appreciate its message?
Yeah, I think that's a good question and really gets to the heart of it, a tension that's central in the French theological turn we talked about, right? So I think that the book is in a way quite theological, but in a manner that mirrors some of those theological turn writers who are operating in French phenomenology. So I would say I wouldn't want my name used in the same sentence as those people because I don't think I belong in the same sentence or paragraph or page as those people. And I know I don't belong in that conversation. But just in my own really small sort of way, I guess I saw the book or I wanted the book to be kind of a continuation or an extension, maybe an application would be a better way to put it, of some of these figures' work, which I see as work that sort of blurs the boundaries actually between philosophy and theology in necessary ways, and kind of calling into question some of the what I think are unreal, but are often treated very rigidly, like this very rigid demarcation between ways of thinking or ways of describing our experience of the real. So we come to hold on to disciplinary boundaries too tightly in a way that isn't consistent with our actual experience in the world. So yeah, it's theological in the sense that I'm writing my own experience, which I experience as inherently theological, and spiritual really might be a more fitting term. So in the book, I don't hesitate to use words like soul, right? That figures really prominently in the book, but also Eucharist, sacrifice, surrender, right? These are very religious terms because I think as a practicing Catholic myself, as I said before, my faith really colors my experience of everything, but especially would say it colors my relationships with the people who are most beloved to me. So it's really impossible for me to. It might be others who are religious might be better at doing this than I am, but I've never really been able to bring myself to hide my faith in my writing. It's like I almost have to. I almost have to show it. But yeah, but I would also say at the same time, I don't think you have to be a religious believer at all, really, to appreciate the book and what it's trying to do. It's theological without being theology, if that makes sense. The book, again, is my attempt to describe a very widely shared experience of being a parent, right? Especially a new parent. And so I think that the content there is something that any parent really could relate to. So, especially anyone thinking about what it's like to parent a young child, to be a new parent, parenting a young child, and dealing with sort of the overwhelm of that experience. And again, I think it kind of comes back to this blurring of the boundaries that we tend to oversimply erect between kind of the religious and the non-religious too, not just between philosophy and theology. And so, for me, from my perspective, I would say I think we are all religious in the sense that we love things profoundly, that we regard some things or some persons as especially precious to us, right? And that our love for those things or those persons exceeds what we can kind of grasp or understand or pin down. And yet that sort of fulsomeness of love is something that we can experience as a recollection, could be a way we would talk about it, as this sort of mysterious unity amongst all the disparate experiences that we undergo in our life. So it's this kind of unifying force where things suddenly hold together in our imagination.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Now, moving on to talk about some of those French phenomenologists that we've mentioned at a couple of points in the conversation already. In the introduction to the book, you write, "In what follows, I will bring some of the epistemological tools Levinas and his two phenomenological predecessors, i.e. Husserl and Heidegger, have offered, and extend these into the terrain of the theological turn that's taken place and continues apace in French and now American phenomenology. This means my book will also engage with phenomenologists like Jean-Luc Marion, Claude Romano, Jean-Yves Lacoste, and Emmanuel Falk. Now, once again, this may be a difficult question to answer, but I wonder which of the philosophers you refer to in the book would you say has been the biggest influence on your thinking, and why? Do you have a favorite?
Yeah, that is really hard to answer, although I love that sort of question. I think I would draw a distinction between the thinkers who are the biggest influences on this book and the thinkers who have been sort of the biggest influences on me just more generally and personally. So, as far as the book, I think the obvious trio would be Levinas, Marion, and Romano. I think they figure most prominently by far in the book. So their explorations on topics like the face, on finitude, on time, the event, were really invaluable to my work, to this book, as I was trying to piece together kind of my experience as a father, and especially kind of reckoning with my daughter's passage through time, and on the sort of preciousness that I experience when I look in the eyes of my daughters, right? So really dealing with these sorts of things. But on a more general level, I would actually say my interests and influences lie with other thinkers, most of whom are not necessarily associated with the theological turn, although one is Jean-Louis Chrétien, I would say, has been very, very influential on me, and he is associated with that, though he writes in a different style, a much more sort of mystical style. I would also say Gabriel Marcel and Byung-Chul Han are two that really come to mind immediately for me. And I know you and I have emailed a little bit about Gabriel Marcel. I think that in part, what I like about those thinkers is that, and I don't want to say this in a way that makes it sound like I'm diminishing their works. I'm not. I actually mean it as a compliment, but I think they're by and large sort of less rigorous in their writing and in their approach to thinking. So it's a little less sort of like academic ivory tower sort of style. But also, I think because their writing feels to me, like I said, a kind of mystical philosophy at times, right? A type of philosophy that's more directly engaged with life and not just with sort of books and with the ideas of other thinkers. So it's a little less textual and a little more experiential, I would say. And I think my own thinking is maybe a little more existentialist in that way, and that I'm kind of more interested in attending to concrete life and to spiritual life than I am in sort of poring over tomes and tomes of the history of philosophy and doing that kind of technical and textual analysis of primary sources. So I would say also though that my thinking has somewhat shifted since I wrote the book. I would still really stand behind everything I wrote, um, but kind of keeping in mind it has been a few years since I wrote it. This is one of the weird parts about interviewing on a book you wrote is it's generally been 2, 3 or more years since you wrote it. So as I said, I would still stand behind what I wrote in the book for sure, but I would also I think want to extend it into new territory, kind of along the lines I mentioned earlier with the sort of Eucharistic and eschatological heart, or this sort of center of fatherhood as I see it. Another reason for the shift, I would say, is I think people like Levinas, Mario, and Romano, they're all thinkers with what I would say is a certain sort of passive streak, and I don't want to oversimplify here because they all have very large bodies of writing, but my experience reading them is that they're thinkers who sort of describe phenomena as something that we undergo, right? As something that sort of happens to us. And I think that's good and right. I think that's a very necessary sort of half of the picture that we have to describe. But I have, for myself, I think become much more interested lately in thinkers who also tend to sort of our creative agency as human beings, right? How we respond to the phenomena that visit us, how we sort of actively build and shape a life out of the phenomena that visit us. So I think there's been a significant shift for me, or a progression perhaps, sort of drawing forward not just in my thinking, but also I would say in my practical life and my fathering, from sort of the passive to the active, right? Not leaving behind the passive, but sort of drawing it up into the active, or as I said, kind of bringing all the passive along with me as I begin to venture into what I would say is a much more sort of active way of thinking, into kind of this kind of creative agency.
Thank you. I'd like to dig a little deeper into the way that you use some of these thinkers, individual thinkers, in in the book, and maybe starting with Levinas and Marion. So, in the first substantive chapter of the book, you've already mentioned this idea of the child's soul. The chapter is called Facing the Child's Soul, and you draw principally on Levinas's concepts of the other and the face, as well as Marion's notions of the icon and the saturated phenomenon, to explore the way that the child's face speaks his or her soul to the father in some way. You write that there's something of a sacramental character or iconicity to the child's face, adding, the child's face reveals some invisible mystery, bringing this invisible mystery into visibility to the extent that it can. Can you explain what you meant here and how it relates to your personal experience of fatherhood, and how Levinas and Marion help you to understand that personal experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So in that first chapter after the introduction, I talk about the father's experience of his child's soul, right? And as you said, I'm really drawing on the work of Levinas, his work on the face, and Mario on what he has to say about the face as a kind of icon. And so the first thing I would want to say is that I'm not going to do justice to either of their thoughts on these things. So go visit the sources directly, I would say. But just kind of very briefly, uh, Levinas, I think for his part, he tends to speak of the other's face as this sort of gesture towards excess, or even as I think he uses the word dilation at some point. This dilation onto some kind of uncontainable infinite, and then Marion sort of takes that up and kind of deliberately carries forward Levinas's treatment of the face by speaking of the other's face as what he calls an icon. So, like a sacrament or an icon, the other's face brings some excessive force with it, right? Some invisible kind of power and magnitude that reach us paradoxically through the visible manifestation of our gaze upon them, right? So much as like the Eucharistic body and blood, for example, much as those kind of arrive in the visible species of the host and wine. Okay. So it occurred to me while I was reading Marion that my experience, sort of beholding my daughter's face, sort of envisaging my daughter's face, was precisely the same thing, or was sort of something similar to what he was describing. That there was some existential heft, right, about her person that really bowled me over as a father, especially when I looked in her eyes, right, when I beheld her face. So in the book, I call this invisible, this sort of invisible force, the child's soul. So it's this invisible that arrives in the visible, paradoxically visible form of the child's face. So we could think of it as like the child's face almost as speaking the child's soul, or as offering like a concrete incarnate manifestation to something which we find, I think, terribly hard to name or pin down, but experience as almost as something almost more powerful than we can bear, or than we like know what to do with. So really, what I'm getting at with the soul is like the preciousness of another person, as we experience that in sort of a posture of love towards them.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Now, in a chapter on the child's finitude, you draw on the philosopher Claude Romano's notion of the event, and you write that childhood is in a special way the era of the event's greatest impact. The child's guileless exposedness leaves the child particularly vulnerable to the event's blunt force for good and ill. The child stands completely unarmored in the direct path of the event, having no resources at their disposal to soften its impact. And you go on to write that the father can have a sensitive relationship to the events that appear in his child's life, most especially to those we might call events of suffering or even traumatic events. I wonder if you could explain, for those of us who are not familiar with it, Romano's idea of the event and why you found it useful in understanding the father-child relationship.
Yeah, for sure. So again, this is a situation where I would say I can't do justice to it, and you should go read Romano himself, and he's really really fun to read actually. But one of the things I was grappling with in this book, because I was really grappling with it as a new father, was kind of coming to terms with the reality that my daughter would suffer, right? That just by being a human being, that she would suffer, and that I myself as a father only had so much power or so much control to sort of prevent her from experiencing that suffering, that I couldn't entirely prevent her from experiencing suffering. And also perhaps that suffering would come to shape her in significant ways. That again, I might not have much control over the ways that her suffering would shape her. So as a new father, yeah, I would say I was not at all prepared for the amount of tears that can come from a small child, the sheer volume, the amount of kind of emotional tumult that they can experience in those early years, right? So it was sort of this reckoning with what I was experiencing in my young daughter's sufferings, but it was also this kind of perspective, this forward-looking fear of the sufferings or traumas that she might endure as she got older, right? And realizing that I would have to gradually release her into a world that can often feel quite dark and quite frightening, or that right that can seem this way at the least. So this really kind of messed with me to an extent that I was not at all expecting or prepared for. I did not know that this was going to be a part of my experience of fatherhood
Mm.
beforehand, right? So in some ways, this book was kind of my way of working through those sorts of fears that can visit young parents, whether it's a mother or a father, right? During those years when you're kind of just now, for the first time, really reckoning with this sort of massive protective task that you've been given when you've been gifted with a very vulnerable young child, because all young children are very vulnerable. But it was also, and this is where it gets more personal and more autobiographical, I would say the book was also my way of working through some of my own kind of obsessive compulsive tendencies as a father, right? I'm beginning to try to make sense of how to live in, but also through and beyond some of those tendencies so that I could be the sort of father who actually bravely faces those fears, right, around his child's well-being, but without being captive or victim to those fears. And so that's really where the kind of surrender piece came in that I mentioned earlier. This kind of entrusting of my child, this entrusting of my children's passage through time, even towards death, as frightening as that is to think about. And then in my view, right, all of this passage through time unto glory, like unto sort of as I said earlier, the eschatological fulfillment of my child's soul.
Thank you. That's really helpful in understanding that part of the book. So, in another chapter of the book, Zach, you draw particularly on the work of another French philosopher, Michel Henry, to critique the ways in which, quote, certain features of late modern life coalesce to mute the call of the child's soul by stripping the father of the attentional and ascetical capacities that are required for the task of parental responsibility. So I wonder, what is Henry's critique of modernity? How does it impact on fatherhood? And how should the responsible father combat what you call the consumptive mode of attention typical of late modernity?
Yeah, I'll try to get through this quickly without butchering Henri's critique of modernity too much. I think it's a hard one to sum up quickly and easily. I would say Henri's philosophy is one of those that's especially difficult to kind of boil down for something like a podcast, and I'm myself am kind of still trying to piece together what exactly he's up to in his work. But I think just to take a crack at it, I think what's maybe kind of at the heart of Henri's criticism of modernity is the way that for him, this modern age, idolizes objectivity as a mode of knowledge. So another way to say this is that it's an age that sort of confines the reality of any kind of given thing or person to an object, right? To objecthood could be another way we could put it. So it kind of closes down the saturated phenomena, right? The excessive experiences that Marion and Levinas are so interested in, and then Henri also sees this kind of objectifying framing of reality as descending into a kind of profaning of life, and ultimately into a certain nihilism, right? Because everything becomes just reduced to being an object. As for kind of how I'm making sense of Henri's criticism of modernity as it relates to fatherhood, right, the way as I'm trying to do this in the book, I'm basically trying to kind of build upon his work on this front by showing the ways that this idolatry of objectivity kind of manifests itself in a capitalistic age in particular. So that's sort of the turn that I'm taking in the book with it, right? How that sort of nihilistic objectivity of the market in particular kind of cultivates forms of life that maybe aren't proper to human life and to family life in particular, right? That aren't fitting for the family. So I write about both speed and consumption as kind of the two of the primary threads in the kinds of forms of life that the late modern age kind of channels us into and channels our families into. So I have in mind there sort of the ways that speed and consumption, right, upon which sort of the market is built, and which have kind of come to dominate in many ways our way of being in the world as human persons, right? Though I have in mind kind of the ways that these erode the sort of attention and the asceticism that I think are called for in family life, right? Particularly in the task of parenthood. So how to combat all that? That's a really hard question. Much harder than just kind of simply diagnosing the ills of the age, I think. And this is something I'm still very much thinking through myself as sort of a constructive response. But one thing I would kind of briefly point towards in the book that I'm trying to do is this rethinking of enjoyment, right?
Mhm.
Because I think our current understanding of enjoyment is by and large pretty narcissistic, right? And that we in a lot of ways, kind of approach our lives as consumers first and foremost, whether we realize it or not, or intend to, or not. So one example of that would be that I could point to would be the child-free movement, which I don't know if you've heard of or if your
Yeah.
listeners have heard of. But people are starting to call for like certain child-free spaces, so like child-free grocery stores, cafes, flights, neighborhoods, apartment complexes. To me, that all feels sort of like a kind of a glaring sign of immaturity. That's maybe putting it a little bluntly, but I think it kind of reflects a more general resistance to the kinds of frictions and difficulties that our kind of interpersonal ethical responsibilities inherently impose on us. But those, I would say, those kinds of frictions and difficulties are also what make life interesting and dynamic and beautiful. So we're really missing something when we try to live a life that's free of those kinds of frictions. So I try to rethink this idea of enjoyment along lines that I hope sort of illuminate the ways that a life of responsibility for others can actually be a very joyous and gratifying form of life, and can actually be joyous and gratifying in ways that maybe the sort of thinner enjoyments of the dominant forms of life today simply kind of can't offer for us. So I point in the book to, for instance, Pope Francis's
Mm.
encyclical on family love, which is just an amazing text. You should all go read it. But I think that encyclical really kind of models in a special way the joys that I'm talking about that are sort of just part and parcel of a life of kind of responsibility within the family setting.
Yeah, and I agree. I thought what you wrote about Pope Francis and Levinas on enjoyment in the book was really interesting. And yeah, that child-free debate is very lively on Substack at the moment, I can tell you.
Yeah.
Uh, anyway, turning to something different now, quite different to enjoyment, and that's the idea of sacrifice. In the final substantive chapter of your book, before the conclusion, has the same title as the book itself. That's to say, The Unthinkable Sacrifice. I'm going to read quite a long quote from it. You begin the chapter with these words: "For all the joy the father can find in his child," which you've obviously just referred to, "we should not diminish the fact that the father's responsibility is also a great burden to carry. Indeed that the burden of responsibility is so great as to often seem overwhelming. Faced with all the exorbitant need calling from the child's face, the father confronts both his own limitations and his capacity for violence. It would not be hyperbolic, at least in the case of the young child, to speak of an onslaught of overwhelming need that issues from the child's face." And in the chapter, you go on to write about how the child's vulnerability is often met by the father's realization of his own inadequacy. I wonder if you could just expand on that and to say, if you don't mind me asking, to what extent your analysis in this chapter was grounded in your own experience as a father.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't mind you asking, and I would say yes, 100%. It was based on my own experience as a young father. I will say I think I think, and this is kind of another shift since writing the book, I would say that my experience has morphed a bit over time as my oldest daughter has gotten a little older. And then especially as we, welcomed our second child and now we're awaiting our third child, we're kind of starting to get deeper into family life, into our experience as parents. So the chapter, I think it probably would speak most of all to first time parents, as I've said, kind of who are reckoning with their own inadequacy, with sort of not knowing what they're doing and trying to figure it out on the fly. But I think it also relates in a more general way to all parents, and that we sort of never stop being inadequate as far as I can see. I don't think we probably ever become adequate for the task of parenthood. Again, I'm still a young father. I'm still in the early years of fatherhood. So I'm speaking, as someone still relatively fresh in the process. But I would say just even in the 6 or so years that I have been a father, the experience has gone from one of feeling like pretty profound inadequacy early on to one of becoming, I would say, considerably more comfortable with my own inadequacy in a way. It's not necessarily like back then I didn't know what I was doing, and now I do know what I'm doing. But I would instead frame it as like maybe now I'm a little bit more confident being in situations where I don't know what I'm doing, if that makes sense. So I guess I imagine it like someone learning how to do like improv or something like that, right? So it's probably terrifying and overwhelming at first, right? When you first begin practicing. And my dad described this when he transitioned into ministry with preaching, right? That at first it was really, really nerve-wracking, but then you kind of gradually begin to get more and more comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, with sort of that uncertainty that you experience. You begin to kind of build a resiliency for navigating the kinds of unexpected situations that you might find yourself in, right? So you become kind of capable with being incapable, if that makes sense. But again, yeah, I'm still a young father, but I would say I can't imagine that fathers are ever really up to the task of responding adequately to their child's face, and sort of the passage of that face, that soul, through time and through the inevitable sufferings it will undergo, right? And that's not even necessarily because of any fault of the father, though we all have faults as fathers, all of us do. But more so just because I don't think any one person can carry sort of the plenitude of another person's soul. I don't think this is possible. There's this sort of like mindness, one's ownness to the soul, that even though it can be cherished, it can be loved, it can be encouraged and held up, and held on to through whatever trials it faces, it still has this like too muchness about it, this fulsomeness that no other human being can carry, at least in my view. And that even like I'm not even sure we can carry our own souls. I think even that might be too fulsome for us ourselves to carry. And so again, that kind of brings us to that aspect of parenthood that is Eucharistic, right? And it's surrender of this child to a boundless love that can indeed carry it and does carry it. And this is where my own kind of religious sensibilities really come through, right? Because for me, this boundless love, of course, is Christ.
That's beautifully put. Thank you. And as a much older father and now a grandfather, I can confirm that feeling of inadequacy never does go away.
Okay.
Now, in the same chapter of the book, Zach, you draw once again on contemporary French philosophy. For example, you preface the chapter with quotations from Jean-Louis Chrétien, who you mentioned earlier. But at the heart of this chapter is your reflection on three stories. The first, the biblical story of Abraham's near sacrifice of his son Isaac. Secondly, the Russian director Andrei Tarkovsky's film The Sacrifice. And thirdly, Jordan Peele's 2017 horror film Get Out. I wonder if you could say something about your decision to focus on those particular examples and how they illustrate what you mean by the term the unthinkable sacrifice in the context of fatherhood.
Yeah, that was a really fun chapter to write because I got to draw on a couple of films that I really, really hold dear. It was, however, though, a really kind of emotionally difficult chapter to work through, I would say. I think for the sake of brevity, I'll focus on the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac here. because I think that already gives me probably too much to try to unravel just looking at that. I would highly recommend listeners to go watch those movies, The Sacrifice and Get Out, which are both fantastic in very different kinds of ways. They're two very different kinds of movies. Yeah. So as far as this, Abraham Isaac story from the Hebrew Bible, I think it's an especially kind of unsettling passage of scripture, and one that's been kind of notoriously challenging for readers to sort out its meaning throughout the ages. So, for those who might not be familiar with the passage, basically, to really oversimplify it, God kind of tells Abraham to take his only son, who's his kind of long-awaited son, to take him up a mountain and to kill him and to kind of offer this son Isaac to God. And so Abraham does exactly that. So he takes his boy up the mountain, he ties him up, he lays him on top of the wood to offer him as a sacrifice. He raises his knife to kill his son, and then an angel, thank God, intervenes and says to Abraham, and I'm quoting here, he says, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." So for me, this biblical passage, even though it's obviously a disturbing one, right? I think it presents a kind of question of possessiveness, right? So is Abraham prepared to let go of his son, if that's what he has to do? Is he prepared to deface himself in a way where he has kind of no hope of any kind of recovery of like a normal and flourishing life afterwards? Like, how can you ever recover and not be kind of endlessly and agonizingly tormented after such an act, right? And so I'm very grateful that none of us as parents are called upon to make such an awful sacrifice. But I think the story really gets at this question of what it means to kind of face the fears we have about our children, right? The kinds of irreversible damage that we're so afraid of discovering in our kids as they kind of journey through time, as they inevitably endure sufferings of their own. So, what does it mean to accept that we don't possess our children, right? That we don't have and maybe shouldn't have control over them or total control, that we have to kind of slowly release them into the world, that we can't protect them from everything, and maybe we shouldn't protect them from everything. And maybe we'd only be kind of suffocating them with our love and depriving them of their freedom, if we tried to protect them from everything.
Thank you. And I'd certainly recommend, I don't know that horror film, but I'm a big fan of Andrei Tarkovsky, so recommend people to read what you say about the sacrifice. Now, this emphasis on sacrifice, it brings me on to a couple of the criticisms that have been made of the book by others, which I want you to give you the opportunity to respond to. And I mentioned in my introduction that I found my way to your book originally via that review by Terence Sweeney in Fairer Disputations. Sweeney had two main criticisms of the book. And one was that although, as he says, parenting is often hard, frustrating, and infuriating, and yes, the baby's face does summon forth the deepest call of responsibility, he reminds us that the baby also smiles for the first time, laughs at your silly faces, and stares in total wonder at his hand for about a month as he realizes it's part of his body. That is the fun and funny stuff. And he suggests that maybe you underplay these lighter, more positive aspects of fatherhood in your emphasis on responsibility and sacrifice. So do you think you're in danger of overemphasizing the negative?
Yeah, I think it's a good and fair question. And I really enjoyed reading Terrence's review, and I was really grateful that he took time to engage with the book as thoughtfully as he did. And I think it's true. The book does tend to focus on the negative for sure. Again, I was really writing this as kind of a way to work through some of those fears I talked about as a young father, right? Fears which I at the time I sort of suspected were probably more common than is generally thought. So the book's it's a very short book, right? It's only like 60, I think it's less than 60 pages maybe. So it's not meant to be an exhaustive text on fatherhood, right? It's as the subtitle implies. I mean more by essay than just that it's a short treatment, but it's an essay, right? It's a kind of an extended essay. And I would say like also in fairness to the book, I do attend to a lot that is positive about parenthood there. I like my treatment of the soul, for instance, right? It's meant to be kind of an exploration of this kind of really tremendous gift that a child is to their father, and how difficult it is to put into words, like just how precious and dear that gift is. And then again, I would say I'd point to like the exploration of enjoyment in fatherhood that we talked about earlier, right? Of what I call in the book joy, or kind of an enjoyment beyond enjoyment, right? That this kind of enjoyment that's present in the fatherly task, and then an enjoyment that is sort of beyond the kind of thinner enjoyments of a life that sort of operates at the level of like an I for myself, instead of like an I for another, is kind of the language I use in the book. I would also say, like, I see this book very much as just kind of my first, I mean, it's my first foray into writing, period, or publishing a book, period. But certainly my first foray into like writing about family life and fatherhood. I do hope to return to the topic in the future, and I hope to perhaps return to kind of a fuller treatment of the kind of parental joy that I explore pretty briefly in the book. I'd like to give that a fuller account, I think. But yeah, I think Terrence definitely had his finger on the pulse for sure. This book, I think, in a lot of ways, is a book about the father's confrontation with his child's fragility, right? So that was the topic that I was really trying to hone in on and go deep with here in the book. So I think it succeeds in what I set out to do, even if it doesn't necessarily treat some of the kind of lighter aspects that he might have liked to see in the book. But those are, again, aspects that I'd like to return to in future writing, I think.
That's a good response, I think, to his criticism. Now, his other criticism is that this isn't a book about fatherhood so much as parenting, and that much of what you write is also true for mothers. And he writes in the review, much of what parents do is shared. It's a Venn diagram with a lot of overlap. But there are aspects particular to a man as a father and to a woman as a mother. Mickle does not dwell on the aspects of parenting that does not overlap, that is unique to a father. I kept thinking he would, and I wish he'd added one more chapter in this short book to explore what's distinctive. I wonder how you'd respond to that, Zach.
Yeah, I mean, it's again a fair criticism. I think I'm pretty much guilty as charged on that one as well. I don't think I was prepared to write about the distinctiveness of a father at that time, and I think even still, I'm sort of working through what that means. I think that Terrence's criticisms in general, the two criticisms you've mentioned already, were pretty much on point. But I also think that what he expressed to me kind of wanting to do was for me to kind of move into terrain that would be good and worthwhile, very much, but that I never really intended to get into in this book. So the matter of kind of the distinctiveness of the father and of the father's role, I think again, I'd like to give more thought to that and to perhaps write on it in the future when I start to formulate things a little more clearly. But I think for me, this like question of gendered care, and I know you've done a lot of work on this, I think it's a bit tricky. And I think it's something that I would really have to give a lot more thought to, because for me, I'm not sure I've imagined or experienced my practice of parenting, including kind of my practice of parenting together alongside my wife. I'm not sure I've experienced that as something that's been all that terribly gendered for me. Or if I have, it's been largely sort of unconscious. It's just not something that's kind of occupied a lot of mental space for me personally. And then I would also say, like, when it comes to questions of gender, I do tend to place in my own thinking, I do tend to place kind of a lot more stock in biology and in sort of the personal contingencies of a person's life than I do in sort of gendered culture norms, or how those gender norms kind of affect a person's expression of their gender. So I think these sorts of questions are really like kind of too complicated for us to make these kind of universal sweeping claims about kind of the masculine and feminine in parenthood. But I think that if we start from biology and personal contingency, what we would see is that each man's practice of fatherhood looks very different, right? That it can take many different kinds of forms, right? Not that every male body is the same, right? So some are kind of large and muscular, some are thin and weak, some are maybe more lean and athletic, some are lethargic, some are energetic, some are highly sexualized, others not so much, right? Some are tender, others are maybe a little more rough and brutish. And I would say, even kind of within one single person's body, we kind of see many changes in its disposition, not just over a lifetime, but even kind of from moment to moment. We see this sort of dynamism, right? So my biology, for instance, it looks very looks very different like when I'm using like heavy and dangerous power tools at work, right? To cut out this big 4-inch cast iron pipe or something. It looks very different when I'm doing that versus like, when I'm praying with my daughters before bed and tucking them into bed and kissing them on the forehead, right? My embodied expression of my gender looks very different in those moments. And also like my like cutting out that cast iron pipe at work, just to kind of complicate things further, I would say that's largely, in some respects, an act of care for my daughters, right? That my daughters kind of need that, their need kind of motivates me to do that sort of work. And I perform that work in large part to kind of care for them and their need, right? To provide for them. So I think there's a real, as I said, a kind of real dynamism at work in a kind of father's performance of his gender as father. Whereas I think in the popular discourse and just in our general understanding, we tend to like really oversimplify.
I think that's all really fair. And as you say, it's not something you go into in the book, but maybe you'll have another opportunity to write. Because the other thing I was going to say is that you admit at the end of the book that you wrote it while still immersed in the experience of the early years of raising a young child, and you say you wonder whether in 5 or 10 years' time I'll look back on this book and think that my description was too myopic. So thank you for answering those questions about the book, Zach. But moving on from the book, I mentioned in my introduction that you're currently co-editing another book on the Eucharist and continental philosophy. And I realize it's not of direct relevance to our discussion of fatherhood and care, but I am interested to hear more about it, especially as it seems like you'll be continuing your engagement with phenomenology. Could you say briefly a bit more about that project and your contribution to it?
Yeah, sure. I think that this book emerged from me feeling a little bit unsatisfied with kind of the general sort of theologies and philosophies of the liturgy and the Eucharist that are on offer, and feeling just kind of like tired of the sort of staleness of a lot of like scholastic kind of thinking the Eucharist in terms of kind of scholastic categories, and feeling like that's makes it really difficult for us to kind of translate into our own ways of thinking today, and particularly, how what does the Eucharist have to do with our concrete lives in the world, right? How does the Eucharist sort of shape us as persons who live in the world? So yeah, I mean, thanks to kind of my work at Whippenstock, where I was able to like network with a lot of people who are doing really interesting work on these sorts of fronts. I was able to draw together, I think there's 11 or 12 contributors. So it's still very much in the early stages. I've collected all the chapter contributions, and so now I'm kind of busy editing all that and getting it ready for submission. So it'll probably be, 2027, 2028 before it comes out, as you said, with Fordham University Press. But it's a project I'm really excited about, and that I've really enjoyed working on. So I'm looking forward to seeing it come to fruition for sure.
Well, good. I wish you all the best with that. And a final question then. I wonder how you see your intellectual interests and activities developing in the future beyond that book. Do you see yourself researching and writing more about phenomenology, about caring relationships within the family? Where do you see your future as a philosophical thinker, obviously alongside your life as a parent going in the future?
The quick and honest answer is that I don't know, because it's largely kind of just now beginning to unfold for me how I might start to integrate all of these things in my life, especially my new career as a plumber, but also, with our family kind of growing. So I'd say right now my energies are very much focused on my family, and on the kind of plumbing apprenticeship program that I'm currently in. So until I'm sort of out of that stage, until I'm done with that 4-year apprenticeship, and until my girls are a little bit older, probably as well, I'm not really in a stage where I'm like setting out to complete a bunch of philosophy projects in the near future, or really any, maybe beyond the Eucharist project for a while. I do definitely see myself writing more about family life and fatherhood, and continuing to kind of engage with continental philosophy. And I would say, yeah, certainly my new career as a plumber has me kind of leaning into even more into kind of the concrete in my thinking, and kind of thinking through how our relationship with material reality is shaped by like our surrounding culture, and what sort of agency we might have in kind of cultivating our children's relationship with material reality, as compared to like how the broader culture sort of cultivates their relationship to material reality, and perhaps in ways that might be concerning to us.
That all sounds fascinating, and I hope you do get a chance to write about those things. So Zach, it just remains for me to thank you for being a guest on the podcast today and for offering some insights into the background to your fascinating book. I certainly feel the book and our conversation today have deepened my understanding of the experience of fatherhood, as well as my understanding of contemporary French phenomenology, of course. So I wish you all the best for your future work and all the best for the birth of your new child.
Thank you, Martin. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed getting a chance to chat with you today.
Well, that's all we have time for on this episode of Careful Thinking. If you've enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll consider subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to leave a comment about this or any other episode of the podcast, or get involved in discussing the issues we've explored here, then why not visit my Careful Thinking Substack, which you can subscribe to for free, and which you can find at carefulthinking.substack.com. So thank you for listening, and see you next time.